Well, artificial intelligence has become one of those phrases that now does far too much work, I think. We hear it everywhere. You know, it's a tech story, obviously. It's a market story around the trade, and there is no alternative, be it in the picks and shovels and the chips. And it's a productivity story. It's become a geopolitical story in the fight between the US and China for frontier models. It's a regulatory story. It's a job story, specifically in Africa. And increasingly, as the Pope's recent encyclical pointed out, it's a power story as well. But perhaps the most interesting version of the AI conversation is not really about machines at all. It's about what it reveals about us as human beings. Because for all the talk of large language models and agents and automation and chips and data centers, I think the uncomfortable truth is that this technology is arriving in a world that's already shaped by very human weaknesses. Fear and greed and overconfidence and tribalism that have been on the rise, short-termism, anxiety, and our remarkable ability to believe whatever makes us feel clever or safe or morally superior in whatever context. And I think in financial markets, we have a name for this field of study. It's called behavioral finance. And it asks why people who know better so often do worse. It tries to understand our humanity and our human decision-making processes. Now, why investors are buying high and selling low, for example, why fear and greed still defeat spreadsheets, and why elegant models are routinely mugged by our emotions. And I think artificial intelligence enters that world, and the big question is, will it help us think better, or will it merely industrialize some of those behavioral biases? Scott Galloway and Ed Elson have recently been probing the economic side of this AI moment, the sheer scale of investment and the pressure on valuations, and the question of whether the returns actually justify the costs that we're seeing, and even the provocative idea that in some contexts, humans may still be cheaper than the machine, as we're seeing. And then we saw from a very different direction Pope Leo and his recent encyclical on AI, Magnifica Humanitas. And it was strikingly a much more moral challenge. It argues that AI must serve humanity rather than concentrate power, and that the great test of this technology is whether we can remain profoundly human. So joining us for that conversation, and it's a big conversation, is Nic Andrew, Managing Executive at Nedgroup Investments. And he really has been thinking quite deeply about what happens when machine intelligence collides with the human in the machine here, drawing on behavioral finance and scenario thinking. And Nic, I must say, it's great to have you on the Monocle Banking podcast as we talk about what is a very difficult concept. And I know it was a lengthy frame, but I felt it was necessary, because this does feel almost like the question of our time, doesn't it?
Michael, thank you very much for having me. And I think that intro was excellent because it really does highlight the breadth of the challenge and the complexity and the speed with which we're having to deal with it, with quite a lot of incomplete information. And it is influencing investment decisions. It is influencing society. And I think the variables, there's actually a really good piece you talked about, Scott Galloway, and I think that's often some interesting stuff. There's a very good presentation someone called Benedict Evans talks about, and he gives a tech presentation every, I think, 6 months. It is all about AI eating the world, and he talks about this term, which I think is very true, which is just radical uncertainty. So I think you're spot on.
Yeah, that radical uncertainty, I think, is what's making it so difficult to try and even scenario plan out, what the outcome might be for our future. I was chatting to Hendrik de Tooy of 91 recently at their results, and he just chose to focus on this AI moment to say he's really worried that as a society in South Africa, we're not having the right conversations around how this technology could reshape South African society, especially with our labor market, our levels of inequality, and the way that access is distributed through technology and the potential for it to amplify that inequality. You wrote a very interesting piece recently where you said the question is not quite whether AI will change the world, but what happens when that kind of machine intelligence collides with human psychology. Can you just unpack what you mean by that?
Yes, I think all of us over the last couple of years of engaging with AI have been blown away by both the speed, the complexity of how fast it's moving. But there's some very underlying challenging questions, and you've raised some of them around, particularly for me, who has access? So is it equal or unequal, and where do the benefits accrue? And then what is the governance? And effectively around the governance is how much do we trust AI? And these things are, I think, very profound questions, because depending on the outcomes of those and how we answer that, and how as a society we come to the answers to those questions, different outcomes can be very significant and both potentially and hopefully very positive, but if we're not careful, can have quite significant implications. And you touched on a couple of them, for example, employment.
Yeah, and certainly what we saw recently from the South African government in publishing an AI policy with some references that were found to be hallucinated by a large language model exposed just how much sometimes we implicitly are starting to trust this technology at the highest level even. Thank goodness we've gone back to the drawing board there. But would you say the danger, and we can probably talk about this through finance and every industry, the danger is that we mistake some of the fluency that we see in these models for truth. That because an AI answer is polished and immediate and confident, that we assume it must also be wise.
I think that's absolutely right. All of us and all your listeners would have the experience of putting a prompt or using an agent, and then the answer coming back and being absolutely amazing how it could deal with something so quickly. But then as you look into the detail, realizing that there are some errors, and those errors probably fall into two different types of errors. I guess they're the obvious errors, which hopefully ones can easily pick up, but they're also the nuanced errors, and those ones are very dangerous because AI comes across as really confident and convincing. But to be able to pick up those nuanced ones, you require experience, domain knowledge, and a lot of effort to try to identify what is correct or incorrect. And you cited the example of the AI report by the government, but we've seen that actually across many domains. We've seen top legal firms in the US citing false case law. We've seen academics citing false research papers. So I think that really, really is a big challenge. And the more we hear that, then you start to worry around what can you trust.
Exactly. But I suppose the inverse or the converse of that might be that with that, as a society, might start to build in an inherent filter or frame with which we question almost all the outputs even more. Or we could amplify, if the technology moves at the pace it's moving. And sadly, I think we're probably heading in this direction where it's more likely to amplify some of these very human biases that we have. Is this where you see the intersection of behavioral finance and AI? Because if you look at behavioral finance and you read any of Kahneman and Tversky and all of the forefathers of the science, it was built around the fact that humans are irrational. And if you look at it in markets, that human irrationality really comes up in the way markets swing and struggle to price accurately. Are we now entering an age where behavioral finance becomes a bit more of a core discipline, not just for investing, but really for citizenship and the way we engage with these new machines and technologies?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and I think it's spot on. And we've seen it, and particularly in the area of investments, looked at it through various perspectives. What we are seeing some fund managers are now doing is, as they understand some of the challenges that exist, trying to build in the guardrails that actually challenge some of their natural biases. So to get the LLM to act as a devil's advocate, or to really crit their view, or to look at where they've changed their view or started to present some behavior that's not ideal from a rational investment perspective. And I guess that would be using the tool framework in a way that potentially would reduce behavioral biases. But I think the reality is that human biases are the result of centuries and centuries of natural behavior of us in ages ago, running away from lions to try and save ourselves, from trying to impress other humans or being envious of their belongings. And I think those are very hardwired. And that, together with potentially a lazy use of AI and LLMs, I think can accentuate some of the challenges.
If we just stay there with the way we're seeing fund managers utilize this technology, very interesting point that you raise, that we're seeing fund managers deploy the technology to test their own confirmation bias. And I think it's a very useful way. Often if I ask an AI to support the view that I already hold, it can be very convincing, and some of them are just, that's their default setting as well. But if you prompt correctly, you can have here a very useful partner, sparring partner that is quite good at playing devil's advocate. Is this one of the emerging use cases that you're seeing in the fund management industry? And where else? What are the other biases? I know loss aversion is probably one of the strongest forces in investing. How do you see AI helping investors stay disciplined? Because my concern is it might simply just provide more real-time reasons to panic.
Yes, I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head. Is if, and it's a big if you're aware of these biases and you prompt it appropriately, I think it can assist. And as you mentioned, it feels to me that the natural bias of LLMs, of how they've been programmed, is to be agreeable and to sort of confirm your viewpoint. So one very naturally needs to prompt or set in the guardrails to avoid that. Otherwise, I think the risk increases, fairly materially. One of the things that we've chatted quite a lot around internally is, as more intelligence becomes abundant in the investment world, where is there likely to be outperformance? Because I think in the short term, as you said, with much more information, the ability to process information from a wider source quicker, that the short end of the trade, which is prone to lots of emotion, is probably going to be dominated by machines. And in fact, that's what we've largely seen from a lot of the large hedge funds, for example, in the US. But where I think there will continue to be a large area of opportunity for quite some time is in exploiting behavioral biases. And one of them is it doesn't matter how human and how trained you are. An example is you don't like, and investors don't enjoy, experiencing any period of short-term underperformance. And to be able to manage that is, I think, a very human need, and it requires a lot of skill. And I think that time arbitrage is going to be one of the areas where alpha will remain.
Oh, that is interesting. So what does that do? What does that mean then for the relationship between investors and their financial advisors and institutions such as yourselves?
One of the big things is the way that I see AI is, initially it all worked as in, and this is probably where most people are, it worked a little bit as a personal productivity tool. So you would create a prompt to help you with a meeting or to record minutes, etc. And then I think the next thing that it did, it starts to move into improving existing workflows. So trying to make existing workflows more efficient and embedding them. And many organizations, including ours, would have tried to use things like agents to make it more efficient so that people could spend time on the more important things. I think what might happen going forward is that the various roles might need to be transformed, and advice is an area like this where collecting information and getting some of the detail, a lot of that might well be done by AI, but that the advisor, and the very important role of the advisor, it allows them to then spend time on areas where they can add considerable value. And a lot of that is where we talked previously on behavioral side of acting as a coach. A lot of that is hand-holding through turbulent markets, dealing with people's insecurities, etc. Now, I think that what we'll see is a shift where the really, really good advisors will spend more and more time on that. And that's incredibly important. It can make a massive difference.
Yeah, because in markets, I think the most valuable advice is not often what to buy, but what not to do, to your point. It's that financial coach, someone who can hold your hand through periods of huge volatility. I mean, exactly what we're seeing at the moment, given what's going on in the Middle East, and from one week to the next, not knowing whether or not the US and Iran will be able to find a deal. And huge volatility that introduces in markets. Certainly not a role that I can see a machine playing effectively, a role that human connection and relationship absolutely is made for. How do you see the value chain then, asset management value chain, research and manager selection and portfolio construction and all of that being changed by AI?
For the initial period, I imagine that a lot of what will happen will be looking at existing roles and getting efficiency. So let's just start off. If one's analyzing a company, the initial equity research, the looking at the market, the sector details, so much of that, which previously would have been done by potentially a junior analyst, and this creates a separate challenge which we can chat around, but would have taken them ages. I think one can get to a very high percentage of the value, let's talk at 90% of the value, in a very short time, very cheaply.
Mm.
And that is effectively going to become a commodity. So what the asset manager is going to need to do, and this is probably true as we go through the value chain, is being really clear on what their value add is, because many components are going to become commoditized.
I want to touch on that point that you raised about the junior advisors work, or, the junior research manager. I think it's so true for any industry, or certainly white collar industries. You can think here of law, any kind of consulting, tax and audit, accounting, anything where a lot of that kind of drudge work that AI is now very competent at doing was often used as a way to feed the pipeline of skills, and new entrants into a profession would do that work. They would acquire some of the skills that no degree can actually equip you for, that you learn on the job, some of the softer skills at the same time. Is there a risk here that we're not having enough of a detailed and in-depth conversation about what that does to the skills pipeline, especially the very front end of the skills pipeline, if we're now handing that work over to AI?
Yes, I think that's a very important conversation, and probably not enough conversation is happening around it. We talk about sort of losing the bottom rung of the ladder, and I think it's a nice metaphor. But if you think around early jobs, as you said, a lot of the time it is coming onto the job, doing work, not initially adding huge amounts of value, making mistakes, but learning from that. And it's through that experience, it's through making the mistakes, it's through your engagement with your manager and your peers that you build up that knowledge, that you build up that wisdom to be able to identify which is the 90 and which is the 10% when only 90% is right.
Mm.
And I am concerned that in many careers, and as you said, mainly in white collar careers, that model that has been effectively the standard model for the last 100 years is breaking down. And what that will really mean in 5-10 years' time, if we don't address it, I think is a genuine concern.
How are you thinking about this internally at Nedgroup Investments? What kind of conversations are you having about ensuring that there's another pathway to onboard juniors who won't now be faced with a lot of the, let's face it, what was quite drudgery kind of work as well?
I think the big thing that we're doing is that we are grappling with it. And one of the big drivers that we've been trying to push is to try to make sure that everyone becomes part of the AI class. Because the irony or the counter side to what I've just said is that I actually think that young people, and particularly young people, if you think when these LLMs came out, it's only at the moment that people entering the workforce now went through their tertiary education using LLMs. I've got children at this sort of age, and how they study is very different to how we used to study. But what it does mean is they effectively can enter the workforce and be incredibly powerful. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to, one, upskill everybody, but bring in young people and try to, at the same time, upskill them in terms of the business and the nuance. And I think they do a lot of that by trying to sit next to and solve problems together, but actually try to get them to accelerate the AI skill and adoption within the broader business.
It's so interesting. You mentioned that I know someone in my family who recently graduated with a physics degree and was battling to find a job straight out of university. I said, well, you've got to knock on a few doors. But what he does know, because he's kind of AI native, or that generation is how to use agents. And so he did a bit of VAC work and designed an entire agentic model for workflow solutions for a freight business. And they're using it now internally inside the business in a matter of weeks. So it is those kinds of skills that I think we're going to see when you pair them as well with some kind of specialization. But being AI native, I think, is going to be so important. And does that mean you as the bank are now approaching this in terms of an upskilling of almost everyone in the bank, saying, right, everyone's got to at least have some basic knowledge of these new tools?
Yes, absolutely. So from the beginning, the big difference that we saw was that AI is a real democratizer compared to prior technologies. And what we're seeing is the most amazing use cases come from areas that you hadn't previously seen before. And that's really exciting. So you're finding someone, whether it be in the HR or the risks department, who previously would have had to rely and come up with an idea and a user case and write down the reason why they wanted to do that and take it through an IT committee, can now come up with an incredibly effective either agent that actually works, or with a working prototype, which they can then, try to get through the business. So definitely a very deliberate strategy is to upskill and to democratize. And then I think linked to that is, and you're seeing this across businesses, how do you take, once you have a concept, because we're finding more and more phenomenal ideas, which we want to encourage, but how do we take them through from a pilot to actually through to the user case? And it's often that last 10%, which legacy businesses, and so businesses like banks or asset managers, which have huge responsibilities in terms of data and security. How do you get that last 10% from a phenomenal working prototype? How do you then make that into something that moves into production? And you can see that's a global challenge, and it's a challenge that we're grappling with as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is probably the hardest part in the entire process. But if you crack that, that's where I think a lot of the new value and the gains are going to come from. And certainly what the market seems to be betting on is that more and more firms are experimenting, as you are and as many other big institutions and banks and asset managers and financial services firms and insurance and elsewhere are also doing. And we'll come back to some of the market assumptions. But I think, allied to this idea of a generation that's been AI native and being able to come into the workforce and do this, I'm not sure how much you're picking up on this trend, but there does certainly seem to be a trend amongst that generation of pushing back against AI. I think they are worried. They're worried about what it might do to jobs, about what it might do to society. So there is almost this generation that is starting to rebel against AI in a sense. And I think it touches on the heart of this idea of trust. And I mean, you've argued that trust may become the defining currency of the next decade. And the problem is that we see so much distrust around the place. I mean, people already distrust politicians and they distrust the media. And if you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, fortunately, we are slightly higher than politicians. But I mean, what happens when AI-generated content makes truth or our understanding of what is true so much more contestable?
Yes, I think if the trust isn't there, and trust would come through transparency, trust would come through being able to be audited and challenged, and around having responsibility, ultimately there being very clear responsibility. If that doesn't happen, then we are all exposed, one, to a verification tax, which is expensive and costly, but at the same time, it introduces a whole range of societal challenges. And you've talked around that it can, between the haves and the have-nots, to those who are looking to benefit versus not benefit. I think we're seeing this in the US at the moment around data centers and increase that it's having on energy prices and people's daily lives, versus on the other side, a few tech billionaire or trillionaires who seem to be the major beneficiaries. And a lot of that boils down to, do people, and it includes young people, but I would say that it's broader than that, do they genuinely trust and believe that access and benefit is going to be broad, or is it going to remain narrow and limited to a few individuals?
Glad you broadened the frame, because it really is. If trust is really going to be at the center of all of this, then we have to be asking those searching questions that the Pope has also asked us to think on and to meditate on. Is, how are the benefits shared most equitably, without throttling innovation and without trying to think that some kind of socialist intervention is the best solution, which history has certainly proven isn't in markets. And in South Africa, I think trust is already fragile because of, inequality, as I mentioned, but corruption and service delivery failure, and there's been a range of institutional disappointment. So how does this conversation find itself in a low-trust society such as South Africa? And what do we need to do, just at a very high level, Nic, to ensure that we can build trust in this technology?
It's very difficult sitting in South Africa, where I think a lot of the rules are being written at the moment in the US and potentially in China. Overall, one would hope that some regulation, and hopefully not regulation that stifles innovation, but that regulation is there. And I'm not sure if you've seen the latest detail and some of the issues that Anthropic has raised, where they are identifying that they would like a halt on some development until there can be better guardrails. And I think that's an example where I think that we need to make progress, because on the other side of it, the optimistic side from a South African perspective is, if one can get this right, just imagine the benefits that this could have for education. Just imagine, you used the example of a relative of yours starting a business. The ability to start a business with limited capital in a short period of time in niches is better than it's ever been before. The ability to solve some of our educational challenges by providing personalized tutoring that's relevant to the individual student. The potential is just so much bigger than it's ever been. There's a phenomenal school actually in the US, I think it's called the Alpha School, Joe Limont, where the work that they're doing and the results that they're getting are just absolutely extraordinary. And what we really need to try to make sure is that South Africa benefits from aspects of that.
Difficult, as you say, when the rules feel like, and for all intents and purposes actually are being written in markets and in regions of the world so far removed from where we sit currently. It's very much a conversation that's taking place amongst the elite in Silicon Valley and the White House and parts of Europe and Asia with the Chinese models. And Pope Leo XIV's AI encyclical was fascinating. It's interesting to see how much it gripped the public attention. And he argues that AI must serve humanity rather than concentrate power. And it sounds almost theological, but it's also, I think, it's a very practical governance question that you've just kind of touched on as well. And I hear the positives. And I mentioned one and you reinforced it. But, there's obviously this optimistic, there's a version where all of the dull, repetitive work disappears and we freed up to be more creative and meaningful individuals. There's also a darker version where people are simply rendered economically redundant. Meta recently laying off, 8,000 people, and whoever remained, well, you're now going to be monitored by our AI because we wanted to see how the best who've remained behind do their jobs. We're very dystopian that, the kind of the Damoclesian sword being there that pretty soon the AI is going to take your job as well. I mean, which version do you think is more plausible?
I think I'll go back to the Benedict Evans quote of radical uncertainty. And I think that there are two very divergent views. He puts a really nice, he says, ask any question about AI and it's got two answers. The one answer is either I don't know, or look at what happened when there's other major technological changes. And again, when one reads and studies on the specific question you've raised, the experts seem to come up with two very, very different views. And that's why I do think it's so important that it's discussed and we engage it. And on the one side, and often many of the people who have a view have a conflict of interest, but if you listen to Jensen Huang, he talks about abundance and why is GDP growth limited, and when we've previously had technological changes We always imagined that it would have a certain impact, but it created an element of creative innovation and that the world grew. What you can see the potential here is for massive productivity, but you can also see a whole element of the labor force being displaced. And that's a challenge and needs to be discussed and considered.
Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction. I suppose the worry is that the waves are so large this time that, the collateral damage might be large swathes of the social contract. And we're all grappling with it, Nic. It's not like anyone really has an answer in an area of radical uncertainty, as you say, from Benedict Evans, to think about how we can map out a future becomes extremely tricky. And I think, in markets, we often ask whether a company can create shareholder value. Drawing on what the Pope's encyclical has expressed as concerns and ways that we should think about governance, should we also be asking then whether AI business models can create human value in the way that we implement this technology?
Definitely. One can see some of the obvious areas if you consider something like healthcare and creating benefit. For me, the most obvious ones are probably healthcare, education, which I've discussed, I think has tremendous potential. So would, we talked about advice, your ability for everyone to get reasonably good advice, whether it be legal, whether it be financial. The whole democratization of that could offer significant widespread benefit.
Yeah. And in terms of benefits, and I want to come back to what Scott Galloway and Ed Elson have been asking, I've really been enjoying their podcasts of late.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, whether the AI capex boom can justify itself. I think it's a big question that everyone's trying to get their heads around, given just how large these capex numbers are on data centers and what it'll mean for energy to power these data centers. What is behavioral? Let's just put the behavioral finance lens on this. What does it tell us about where we are and technology manias? Because we've seen them in the past, the railways, .com, radio, even crypto, all of those. The tech can be real. The valuations can still be quite mad, can't they?
Yes, I think that is the trillion-dollar question, is this time different? I think there's a huge amount that we don't know, and many of those are the items that we've touched on, but there are some things that we do know. And what we do know is just the level and scale of this is absolutely extraordinary and unprecedented. You talked about data centers. I saw a stat saying data centers, which like broadly didn't exist 10 years ago, now make up more capex than all offices in terms of construction value. These numbers, the take-up is just massive. And I guess, one, we know that the capex is really big. The other thing that we do know is you have to then ask, where is this being funded from? And initially, a lot of that was being funded by sort of the free cash flows of the hyperscalers. Then I think we moved to some quite interesting funding structures. And you can see we're now getting through to the equity side. And that probably shows that we're a bit further down the cycle. And the other interesting element linked to that is ultimately with all the spend is, where does that return come from? And that return needs to come from corporates, I think predominantly corporates rather than individuals, corporates willing to invest significantly to see those efficiency or revenue benefits that we discussed. And more recently, and particularly in the last couple of months, I've seen many of these technology companies, these CFOs, I saw the CFO of Uber questioning their spend, that they'd run out of their whole AI capex.
Yeah.
By April, you saw that with Shopify, you've seen it at Microsoft. So I think the whole return on investment is going to be a really, really interesting one to watch. And in the end, will determine whether or not, these are good investments or not.
Yeah, I've seen all of that as well. And interesting to see even from Sam Altman's OpenAI, who are eyeing an IPO, putting out statements that some of their customers are scaling back. And that's not the kind of talk you want to be putting in the market if you're kind of bullish ahead of an IPO. So, and Prof G also questions whether we may in some cases still be cheaper than AI as human labor. And it does feel to an extent we've become dazzled by the automation and the promise that we sometimes ignore the mundane economics. It'll be very interesting to see how all of that does play out or pan out. But I'm reminded as well of a Jeff Bezos interview where he said, listen, there were lots of bubbles during the .com era and we're building out the internet. And it's not to say that society wasn't left with a net benefit, because we were in the World Wide Web. but just that some business models and some companies weren't the ultimate winners. And I think very much in the AI narrative as well, we're going to be left with what is a net benefit for society, but you might not necessarily be winning if you're going to put all your chips on a particular player in the AI ecosystem right now. That's certainly my view. Others will argue. I think others have a much more dystopian view of where this technology can take us. I think as long as we are having these conversations around how it's going to impact society, how it's going to impact your business, what did leaders do in thinking about the technology, then I do think we're kind of holding the line against that dystopian future. Just, Nic, as we end off, you've drawn inspirations from the late Clem Sunter and his excellent scenario planning work. So let's just frame this as a couple of scenarios as we end off. What are the 2 or 3 kind of plausible AI futures that you see for South Africa to help us think about where this technology is going?
Thanks. Yes, in the sort of similar to what Clem did in his scenario planning, I think 2 ways to look at it are to try to identify whether there is going to be broad access and benefit, or whether that's going to be concentrated on the one axis, and on the other axis to try to identify whether the governance is going to be strong or weak. And I think the governance is largely could be aligned to how much trust there is, and access is to the benefit of society. So in an environment where I think there's good governance and high trust, that's a very optimistic scenario where I think one can talk and start to see some of the abundance and the positive things that we've talked around. On the other side, where trust is weak and we end up in a very sort of concentrated environment, or if trust is weak and even if it's broader, those are the areas where when one starts to have high levels of distrust, one starts to pay a big tax around things like verification. We have more and more deep fakes and we have security scams. And effectively what happens then is that society will then probably both take a step back, become more polarized, and I think we won't see the benefit. And I think the real point of having these conversations now is to try to make sure that we move towards that environment of a well-governed environment where there is trust and where large components of society benefit.
Well, Nic Andrew, thank you very much for joining us to have this conversation, a conversation that is only going to grow in importance. And as we've heard, one that doesn't have any neat solutions or answers to, but one that is certainly the question of our age as we grapple with it. That was Nic Andrews, Managing Executive at Nedgroup Investments, talking about artificial intelligence and the human in the machine here on the Monocle Banking Podcast.